Good morning, and welcome, a special welcome to all of you here today, and in particular those that are visiting with us. Some of you for the first time, we add a very special welcome to you. And to those of us that are watching by way of live stream, we welcome you to the Faith Forum. Today we have a wonderful privilege and honor, something that I've been looking forward to all year, and that is to sit and to talk with one of our own. Kathy Izard grew up in El Paso, Texas. She graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a degree in advertising, and she moved to Charlotte to be an art director for ad agencies. And she wanted to devote much of her time also to her 4 daughters, and so she started her own business. In 2007, well, I guess we could say things changed a bit. She met Denver Moore, a formerly homeless man turned best-selling author of Same Kind of Different as Me. And that changed the trajectory of her life. He reminded her at the Urban Ministry Center that she was indeed helping the homeless by serving meals, yes, but what homeless people needed was a home. 2 months later, Kathy closed her design business and she joined the staff of the Urban Ministry Center as the first director of Homeless to Homes, Charlotte's only Housing First program, then turned into a $10 million capital campaign to build an apartment complex called Moore Place. Kathy is a board member and the development chair of Hopeway, Charlotte's first not-for-profit residential mental health treatment center. She is the author of A 100-Story Home, A Journey of Homelessness, Hope, and Healing. She's a talented developer, designer, consultant, social activist. She's a wife to Charlie and the mother of 4 beautiful daughters, and it is an honor to welcome you home to Christ Church.
Thank
Please
you.
join me
Thank
in
you.
welcoming. As we prepare for this conversation, I want you to know that Kathy wrote this book not just to tell her story, but that we all might think about our own stories and the ways that God might be speaking to us. And so, before we talk, let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks that you're always speaking to us. Help us to listen for the whisper, for the still, small voice, and allow that whisper to build, to grow in us, that we might hear you more clearly. Help us, Lord, to trust the whisper, that in following you we find ourselves and we live the life that you have called us to live. Through Christ we pray. Amen. There's a quote that I want to read to you, Kathy, that I want to share with everyone today, that I think in some ways talks about that critical moment that you experience, that we all experience at some moment or not, and the question is, what do we do when the moment comes? And so this is, and I want to kind of get your reaction to it. This is from the theologian Howard Thurman, that was written in a sermon delivered at the Church of the Advent in 1960. He says, "In every life, there are a few special moments that count for more than all the rest, because they meant the taking of a stand, a self-commitment, a decisive choice. It is commitment that creates the person. It is the pressing need to find some meaning for one's own life, to subordinate the whole of life to that meaning. This need, this inner aspiration, is from God. All the formula and doctrines may one day pass away, but the true and living God shall remain. Thus, the knowing encounter with the living God is the greatest possible human event, the human experience par excellence. The circumstances and forms of this encounter may be infinite in their variation, but it always comes as a surprise that it is the direct initiative in my own little life. In my own little life. So was that experience with Denver Moore, was that the experience par excellence for you? What was the pivotal moment when your life changed?
I can say now that it was. I certainly, at the time, I knew something crazy had happened that day. But honestly, it's taken me a good 10 years and 4.5 years of writing to try and see it that way or understand what that moment was. But at the time, I was just taking Denver down to the Urban Ministry Center. He was here for True Blessings. Some of you have been coming to True Blessings with the Urban Ministry Center. It was our luncheon. Again, that was kind of an accidental moment. It was not planned. And I was taking him down because I really thought he was going to change somebody else's life. I thought he was going to change a homeless person's life. And if you've read that book, he's very inspirational in the book. So I was sure he was going to go up to some homeless person and say something that was just going to change what they how they were going to see their circumstance. And now I know he changed me because I was taking him down really to get affirmation of what we were doing. And the Urban Ministry Center at that time, and still is, just an incredible organization. And we were doing all that we thought we could. We were not housing anybody. We were a day ministry. We were serving soup and services. And we got to the end of this tour, and Denver said to me, well, where are the beds? And I said, no, you didn't understand in our tour that we're doing all this great stuff. We have art and gardening and soccer. We're an amazing organization. And he said, well, that's not what I mean. He said, you mean to tell me you do all this good in the day and you lock them out to the bad at night? And I'd been down there for 12 years. I'd been a board member, and I'd never thought of it that way. And he said, does that make any sense to you? I said, no. And he said, are you going to do something about it? And I can tell you at that time, it was not my job. I didn't want it to be my job. But the real problem was, it was nobody's job. Dale Molinex didn't think it was our job. The board had had a retreat. We didn't think it was our job. We were really hoping somebody else in Charlotte might do something for the homeless, that somebody else might decide to house them. And I guess that was the moment when you realize, well, if it's nobody's job, are you willing to make it your job? And I think one of the reasons I was willing to say yes is when I started to feel that it was personal, that I had said yes to him, and I had somehow made this crazy promise to a person I had just met. And I thought about it for at least a day before I even mentioned it to my husband, Charlie. And I said to him, I'm kind of feeling like I have to do this. I'm kind of feeling like I need to quit my job and make it my job. And he didn't call me crazy. And I think if he had, it would have been very easy to say, I'll never see that guy again. He's going back to Fort Worth, and he'll never remember he talked to me. And Dale certainly doesn't want to change the Urban Ministry Center, so it's okay, we'll all go on. But I think having him understand and back that was really important, to have my family say, okay, and then to have Dale say, sure, you're completely unqualified, but come on, make it your job. Make it our job.
So he was coming to give hope and inspiration for someone else.
Absolutely, in my mind.
And then all of a sudden it takes hold of you. How inconvenient.
So inconvenient. So unexpected, so inconvenient, yes.
Yeah. And I'm struck how inconvenient it is to follow the Lord.
Well, and I will absolutely say that's not what I thought I was doing. I thought I was making a career change, which was much easier to think about. It's still much easier to think about that I was making a career change. I wasn't answering a call. And but in this whole process of writing and in doing More Place and just thinking about everything that's happened in the last decade, it feels much less about a career change and much more something else.
So tell us about your childhood. I mean, were you always sort of in Christian ministry? Were you always about the work of sort of doing big things? And so could we just basically say this was just yet another thing Kathy did, and that would be a very nice thing for us to say, because that would mean that we came today, we heard a professional Christian, and we can go back to our life as usual.
Yeah, no, I was actually a rebel. I came from a long line of Presbyterians. I had Christian Presbyterian ministers on my mother's side. I had Presbyterian ministers on my father's side, and so there was a lot of forced Presbyterianism in my house. And, youth group and church, and I was always dragged to church. But finally, by high school, I was really over it. And I even told my parents that I didn't want to go to their church anymore. And so my dad, being the smart guy that he was, he said, well, that's fine. You don't have to come to church with us. But you have to find a church that you do want to go to. And then you can go to that church, and then we'll all meet for lunch at Luby's, which was the cafeteria, or my grandmother's house. And you have to bring the program from the church, and we have to discuss the sermon of the church that you go to. So he had my number. He knew I was probably going to go drink coffee somewhere and then just pretend, but he made me discuss the sermons. And I did find this great Presbyterian church in El Paso with this Scottish minister who would always, the reason I loved him, he would stand up at the pulpit and he would rip off his robe in the middle of the ceremony and get really exercised. So anyway, I thought that was very entertaining. It was kind of theater in church. And so that was the one I chose. And then after that, after I got out of high school, I just didn't go again for about, many years. So.
What do you remember from those conversations with your dad? Were there things that sort of stuck with you that are clear now that you took with you, or are there things that as you look back on your life, that those conversations about faith with your family come up again?
My father especially, well, both of my parents had a really strong faith. They originated around here. My mom went to Queen's University, my dad Davidson College. And they were both extremely strong in their faith. I think what I remember the most about my father, and I wrote about it a lot in the book, that he just really believed that we all needed to do good, that was just, it wasn't to get to heaven, it was just because you should. It was just something that you should do. And I'm one of 3 girls, and he, even at a time when maybe women were being raised just to marry and have kids, he never talked about that. He talked about, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your life? How are you going to do good? And he was always really involved in El Paso doing things. My mother was really involved. We were taken into South El Paso to work with the Girls Club there on mission work. My father was really involved in things. So it was just a part of the fabric of our family that you give back because you should, not because you're going to get anything from it, or there's some score that's going to let you check off the heaven box, but just because it's what we all should do.
Mm-hmm. And you've been very open in your book that there was also another dimension to your family around the issue of mental health.
Right.
Say something about that.
My mother was bipolar, but we didn't know it when I was growing up. And so about the time I was 6 is when she had her first most noticeable break. And it was probably 16 years, so from the time I was 6 till I was 22, that my mother was in and out of hospitals, in and out of treatment, or what we were trying to find for treatment. But really, I think it started off as not really understanding fully what it was. My mother was and is brilliant, and so it was really hard to understand what was happening to her, and I think my parents' faith was a big part of that. They just kept, they stayed together. I think my mother's faith allowed her, even in her darkest depressions, never to consider taking her own life, which was, lucky for all of us that she, even in the darkest times, never considered that. So God really helped my parents, having that faith, having that something would work out, that there would be a solution. But it was something we dealt with very, very quietly. And literally writing this book the last 4 years is some of the first time my family's ever even talked about it. And I think that's one reason in writing this book, it was painful for my mother to think about that I was going to be talking about this and how it influenced my childhood and how it influenced how I saw people and how I had empathy for certain things. It's turned out to be very cathartic for all of us, because I think not talking about it has been much more painful than talking about it. And I think that happens in a lot of families. You know, on top of what you're dealing with, whatever diagnosis, you're dealing with a shame or a guilt that really should not be associated with it. There was certainly nothing that my mother could have done to alleviate her own circumstance. It wasn't her fault that she had that diagnosis. But
one of the things that we've been talking about all this year is generosity, and how we come to a place where we become generous, we take the risk of being generous. And we've reflected on the fact that often where generosity comes from is the recognition of what it's like to be vulnerable and afraid. And oftentimes we do want to bury that. We don't want to tell that story because we're raised to think that we're called to be self-reliant, or that we're supposed to be perfect. And so those stories of vulnerability and fear often get pushed down, and yet what your book, what you told us today is that was actually, getting in touch with that was actually what helped enable you to move toward Denver and to move toward the issue of homelessness. You have not, you said that you have never been homeless yourself, but you had an experience where it didn't always feel like home.
exactly.
Yeah, say something about that.
Well, I do think growing up in a family where we were alone a lot of the time. You know, my father sometimes had to. My mother would be hospitalized. We would be, you know, left without her. Where she was this just incredibly perfect, wonderful mother, and then she was gone, and then she wasn't really herself for 16 years. It felt homeless in a way. It felt like we had this family that it was supposed to be, and then it wasn't. And I think also growing up in a border city where there's such a great divide. If you've never been to El Paso, it really is where the U.S. meets poverty and meets Mexico. And there are really places where you're driving down the interstate and you look to your right and there's the University of Texas El Paso with all its electricity and promise of higher ed and opportunity. And literally when you look to the left, there's shacks and dirt and no promise and no opportunity. So I think seeing that all the time definitely imprinted on me. So I was imprinted of the haves and the have-nots, and seeing that all the time and feeling kind of a guilt and shame about that, of not being able to do anything about that, and also being in a family where we were torn apart. And so I think, you know, when Denver says, does that make any sense to you? Well, I could look at a homeless woman on the street and think, know that she had mental illness, understand that, you know, maybe that she had been separated from her family and not being able for her family to help her, and know how lucky my family was that while we weren't exactly the family that we thought we were going to be, we certainly, my mother never ended up homeless. My father kept us together. I had a very strong grandparent that came in and helped our situation. So I think those two things really imprinted on me and made me empathetic for the homeless in Charlotte.
I think the word imprint is a powerful one, because I want to just stop for a moment and just invite you to think about a dimension and a moment, a part of your life story when you were hurting, afraid, vulnerable. Maybe there's an experience that you've had in your life that you don't really like to talk about. Some difficult story that if you were to tell it, you might think that it would suggest that you don't have your act together, or what have you. And I guess when you use the word imprint, I think about that those wounds in our lives are sacred wounds. That when Kathy talks about it, the imprint, I think about Jesus rising from the dead, and he still has his wounds with him. Isn't that interesting? It says, "Put your hands in my wounds, and you'll know who I am." You know, so I'm just sort of struck how easy, Kathy, it would have been to, you know, to come to Charlotte and to push all the things from the past aside and say, "I'm Kathy Izard, attractive, beautiful. I have a lovely husband, handsome, 4 gorgeous daughters. I hope one day you can be as perfect as me." And yet you have, like a leader, you have led with your vulnerability and with your brokenness. And that's made all the difference. So let's go to this moment where you get the word, that you begin to get the word that you're being called into something. Was it a whisper? Or, you know, you go back home, you have a conversation with Charlie, and he tells you you're not crazy. He doesn't say sleep on it and you'll feel differently tomorrow, and then we'll go on vacation.
Well, I think he did, but he didn't call me crazy. Let's be clear. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So how did it build from there? I mean, when God puts something on our hearts, a lot of the times we do push it away, but what was it about this that made you say, I need to keep exploring it? And how did that go? Was that a straight line? Did you go from, I got the idea, gonna get $10 million, we're gonna build it, touchdown, we're done?
No, it went from just hearing Denver's voice and him saying, you know, like, where do you think people go? You know, when the Urban Ministry Center closes its gates at 4:30, what do you think happens? You're locking them out to the bed at night. And then I realized I couldn't sleep very well, which is probably why I hadn't asked myself the question in the 12 years I'd been volunteering down there. I knew that if I'd asked the question, where do they go? What happens when we close the gates at 4:30? I wouldn't be able to sleep very well, and that's what started happening is even though I was doing my graphic work and I had my clients, I couldn't stop thinking about this, and I couldn't stop thinking about what would we do. And my sister Louise, who is throughout the book as well, she's a minister, had received a very inconvenient call in her 30s when she was working for someone else and a dancer and certainly not thinking about being a minister. Got a very inconvenient call that maybe she should go to divinity school. So she wasn't telling me to go to divinity school, but she was saying, I think you should listen. And she also had worked on social justice issues in DC and New York, and she knew about Roseanne Haggerty and Common Grounds, and she said, why don't you just go see the work that they do? Maybe that's the answer. And so I think the fact that I couldn't sleep at night, then going to see that, well, there was a solution. We didn't have to invent the solution. We could just bring the best wheel to Charlotte. And it turned out to be this organization called Common Grounds, and they were doing amazing things. They'd been housing people since the 80s and taking people directly from streets and moving them into homes. And, you know, wonder upon wonder, that's what people needed. That's what homeless people needed, was a home. And why couldn't we do that in Charlotte? Why couldn't we start with just a few people and see that it worked here? And then, so it was the $10 million didn't come in for a while.
So who did you talk to first? Who were the first people that you went to talk to?
I went to Dale and I said, you should do this. Denver told me to tell you to do this. But actually at the same...
What did Dale say to you?
Well, Dale had been having his own, I guess, come to Jesus because John and Pat Moore had approached him. They'd read an article in the Charlotte Observer that was written by Liz Clayson Kelly, and it was talking about this idea of housing first and saying, you know, homeless people need one thing. They need a home. It ends their homelessness. So let's do what other communities have done and move people directly from street to home. And so John had called Dale to come talk about this idea. And John said, this is a great idea, Dale. Dale said, yep, it is. And John said, well, what are you doing about it? It's like, oh, no, that's not our job. We're not doing that. And John said, well, if you were, what would you do? And he said, well, we'd probably start a pilot program. And John said, great, well, how much would that cost? And Dale threw out some magical number, and John said, great, we'll fund that. And so that put Dale in the really interesting position of having, for the first time in the history of the Urban Ministry Center, this amazing grant for a program that we didn't have, and we needed to start it. And so he was busy running the urban ministry, and I'm there saying, well, we should, do something about housing. And he said, well, you have the desire, and I've got some money. Let's put them together and see what happens. And I clearly remember when we were having this conversation in December of 2007, and I said, well, Dale, I'm completely unqualified to take this job. And he said, well, the great news for you is so is everyone else. So
let me just get this straight. Were you an expert in homelessness? And
oh, yeah. I was an expert in crayons and logos, and no, I had absolutely, positively.
What about building, like construction?
Yeah, no.
Or social work and the sorts of things?
I got nothing. No.
Nothing?
No. I had never raised a dime. I had never gone to social work school. Other than serving soup down there for 10 years, I had nothing.
So you could serve some pretty good soup.
Yeah, I can make 600 sandwiches with my daughters in a couple hours, and we can make a 30-gallon pot of soup. That's what I was qualified.
So why didn't you just stop and say, I'm done. I'm going to stick with this. How did it continue to build?
I guess because I felt like I'd made Denver a promise. Mm-hmm. I really felt like when he said, are you going to do something about it? In that moment, I said yes. And he said, do I need to say anything else?
So what was the pilot program?
The pilot program, Homeless to Homes, was taking, originally it was going to be 15. We ended up doing 13 people directly from street to home. We reached out to 13 of the people who'd been down at the Urban Ministry Center for years. We'd been serving them in the lines forever. And we got a fantastic landlord after 4 months of searching, because we had we needed apartments, and we obviously didn't own apartments. And so we were trying to find a landlord that would allow us to move in homeless folks. No surprise, no one wanted us, even if the Urban Ministry Center was paying the rent. No one wanted to move in homeless people.
Now, let me interrupt you and ask you about, when we talk about homeless folks, there are some folks who go through a period of homelessness and then they go back. There's some that are in and out, and then there are chronically homeless people. Mm-hmm. So what was your target group?
We were looking for the chronically homeless. We were looking for those who there was just no place else. I mean, they were not going to get a job. They were not going to, when people say, why don't you, they pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We were looking at the folks who had a disability, were probably mentally ill, who probably had an addiction, who had a physical disability. They'd probably been disconnected from their family. There was nowhere else to go, and they were going to be sleeping on the streets of Charlotte or dying on the streets of Charlotte because there was nothing else to do.
Right, so I'm going to push you a little further, because I'm kind of curious, because some people would say that's not a very good investment, Kathy. Why don't you go to the people who are working poor and can get themselves back on track, or go to people who are in and out? Why care about the most vulnerable people in our society? What's your answer to that?
Well, they were dying. It was a life and death. In 2007, 37 people died on the streets of Charlotte as a result of homelessness. And so I think as a community, you either have to say, we're okay, they can keep dying on the streets, or you can say, we're going to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And I came at it from just the human aspect. I just didn't think that was okay, but there was also an economic reason and an economic argument that we made to this community, that it actually cost our community more money to allow people to die on the streets than it did to house them. Mm-hmm. At the time, we did a lot of matrix, bringing data from other cities, how much it costs to utilize a jail cell or a hospital or an ER, and the fact is we were spending about $30,000 a year on folks who were chronically in and out of jails, in and out of hospitals, and we could house someone for $12,000 a year. So $30,000 a year, and you get nothing for it, and they certainly get nothing for it. Or you can transform someone's life with about $12,000 a year. And so that's how we started. And we started with 4 people. It was May 17th, 2008, and we moved the first 4 people into homeless to homes. There were 3 gentlemen and a woman. Collectively, I think one had been living in the shelter for 7 years. One had been homeless over a decade and was currently in a barn. There was another gentleman who had completed a 28-day alcohol program, but he was going to be released back onto the streets because he had nowhere to go. And the woman was very intellectually disabled and had been living under a car for probably a decade as well. And so we moved them in on this amazing day. And it was this great celebratory. We had all these volunteers, and we moved into these apartments and went home, and it was just such a feel-good moment. And I laid down that night, and then the fear started of what we'd done. But why, yes, we transformed their lives for that moment and that day, but then the fear of, like, was this really going to work? What if right now in these apartments there was a giant party going on, and every homeless person was having a big old, party on the lawn, and what really had we done? It was like having 4 teenagers come to live with you again, and what were they doing while the parents weren't? And that weekend, I worried about it all weekend. We had a social worker and I kept checking my phone, thinking, oh, she's going to call and say, oh, there's been a fire, or something's happened. And I saw the woman that Monday at the Urban Ministry Center, and she came up to me and gave me this huge hug, and which was unusual because she's not a touchy-feely kind of person. And I said, how was your weekend? How was your weekend in your home? And she said, oh my gosh, did you see how it rained yesterday? And I thought, yeah, come to think of it, it did rain. And she said, it rained and I didn't get wet. And that for me was just the moment of, wow, that's how high the bar is for these folks. We just have to keep them dry, And that was a little bit freeing to know that we could keep going. I mean, we were really changing lives by this simple fact of bringing people inside and giving them a safe, dry place to be.
So tell me about the next step from the pilot program to the actual construction, the partnerships, because it's a fascinating story. Where did you find the land?
Well, we were really just going to stay with this pilot program for 2 years, and what we found was that it was like the cure for cancer, that the transformation in those 4 people was so dramatic that when Dale and I got together, after a couple months, we thought, well, why would we wait 2 years to prove that this works when it is so clear that it works, when it's so clear that homeless people need a home, and that so we fast-tracked it, and we started working with a great group of guys, some people who came to the story, Matt Wall, Jerry Licari, Bill Holt, Hugh McCall, all came to try and help us do the next phase, because we were clearly out of our league, a graphic designer and a minister. We had no idea how to get land or build or raise money. So we did start to put together a team, and Matt Wall found a piece of property that was a junkyard. It had trucks on it and old tires, and we thought, but it was properly zoned. And we knew that we would probably not win a zoning battle as long as it had taken us just to find some existing apartments. We knew when we said we're going to build a building and we're going to move in some homeless people, that was not going to go over well. And so we found this junkyard. You can get the book and read the whole 9 yards of the struggle that we had, but it was fairly miraculous in that it was 2008 when we launched this idea of a capital campaign, and it became clear that we were going to need about $10 million to build this building so that we could really bring this solution to more people. And I'm sure you know what happened in 2008. So it could not have been a worse time, but at the same time, I think it could not have been a better time, because there were so many people who maybe had thought, well, I don't understand homelessness. I don't understand how somebody could lose everything in their life. Somehow it's got to be their fault. But with the economic crash in 2008, all of a sudden there was a lot of people who could understand a little bit better how you might get blindsided by something, how you might maybe not be able to prepare for something and really lose everything. And so I actually think launching it in that time was one of the greatest gifts to this capital campaign, because we had this understanding in this community of what it was like to lose everything, of what it was like to lose something. And because that, we had the most incredible groundswell of support to help More Place, to help build this building. And Charlotte and this community and this church, which gave money to this program, should be unbelievably proud of how we came together. Because while there's permanent supportive buildings across the United States now, there is not one in this entire country that was built the way ours was. There is not one that has on the wall 60 houses of faith that came together to give money for the homeless. There's not one that has 400 individual donors who gave everything from $5 to some kids who did a lemonade stand for $120 to really big gifts of $1 million. And that is Charlotte, and that is this city, and that is how we get things done, and it's something that we should be unbelievably proud of.
So tell us about More Place now, Kathy. How many you've added on? How many residents are there? What kind of programs are there? What's going on there now?
So yeah, we've expanded. So More Place, and we opened the building in 2012, and that was 85 units of permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless men and women. It was the first time there was a place for women to go in this community. We've since added on 35 more units just this past year. So that building itself is 120. And in that building, if you walked in, you wouldn't think, oh, this looks like a homeless building. It looks like an apartment building. And it's got, there's an art room, there's a library, there's a clinic on site. So there's a nurse, there's a psychiatrist that can come in. The social workers are in the building. And there's also almost 300 people outside of that have been housed in apartments across Charlotte. So the whole program now is called Housing Works. And we've housed, I believe the number's 424 chronically homeless people since that time. And they're working and living their lives, and they've returned to normalcy. They're housed.
So let me get this straight. So you're a graphic designer.
Yes, was, yeah.
Married, 4 kids. And you're doing something for a charitable organization, and you meet somebody, and that conversation begins to change your life. And though you're not, you say you're not an expert in homelessness, you probably wouldn't, you sound like one now. Though you weren't into urban design and planning, you sound like you know something about that now. Though you didn't know much about supportive services, you know a lot about that now. And I'm struck that you didn't know a lot, but you got into it, and you know a lot now, but you also know what you don't know, which is that there are a lot of other things. But the question that I want to ask is, how do we know when the right time is? How do we know, first, if something that has been placed on our hearts, maybe it's a conversation, maybe it's a TV commercial, or maybe it's something that we've seen on the side as we were driving to the grocery store, or going to the airport, or who knows what it is, something a child is experiencing in our family, or whoever, whatever There's so many things that press upon us. How do we know if those little knocks on our heart are God's whisper? That's the first question. And the second question is, how do we know when it's the right time? Because it would have been real easy for you to say, homeless folks will be with us all the time. We need to get the girls out of college. Charlie needs to retire. I need to retire. Then I'll devote myself fully to this work. So how would you answer those two questions? How do we know when we have the whisper of God and when it's the right time?
Well, I guess going to the first part, I think I know what I don't know. So I certainly didn't recognize any of this in that time. What I know now is what I pay attention to. And I pay attention when my heart starts beating fast. When someone's talking about something and I really feel like, not just, oh, that's nice for you. When I pay attention when my heart's kind of beating fast about something. And so I would say to anyone, if there's something that you're hearing about, when you're talking about homelessness and you're like, oh, that's nice, that doesn't really. But if someone's talking about mentoring a child, or someone's talking about racial injustice, and your heart starts beating a little bit faster because maybe it's going back to that imprint of your story and something from you, I would say pay attention to that. I would say that's a little bit of a knock to you, that it's just maybe not Tuesday, maybe this is your Tuesday. Maybe this is what you're supposed to be listening to. And the second piece, because Charlie would tell you that I can listen to a lot of things and I can get excited about a lot of ideas, so my heart starts beating about a lot of things often. So I stay with them a little while. If it's something really simple, if I'm, and I can do it right then, if I'm just feeling like, oh, you should send a card to that person, or you should go have coffee, well, just do it. If it's simple, go do it. If it's something bigger, if it's something that's going to be disruptive, spend some time with it. Think about it. If you're still not sleeping, if you're still hearing that and your heart's beating fast and it's not leaving you, really pay attention. Explore it. Look into it. What could you do? Well, if you don't know about it, what could you learn about it? So that's how I evaluate things now, and that's how I would say to someone about the right time. I don't know that it's ever the right time, and I would say if it's a call, I'm sure it's not the right time. I'm sure it's inconvenient and unexpected and
Say that
unplanned.
Again. If it's a call, it's probably not the right time.
Yeah, I'm sure you will absolutely positively say it's not the right time. I'm sure you will say this is inconvenient and this is not what I planned and this is disruptive. I know. But if you're still thinking about it and you still can't put it down, then maybe it is the right time. And I especially want to talk maybe to young moms or people who are raising their kids and feeling like, oh, I'm so restless, I want to be doing something right now. But you're not sure what it is. And I would say that everything that you're doing right now is preparing you for what's to be. And I know that there was lots of things that I was doing that I thought, well, maybe were not related to my story or my journey, and the dots all ended up connecting. And I couldn't see it till I looked back. And I know that I was very frustrated sometimes when I had young kids and I was thinking I wanted to be doing something else and something more important, or what I felt was more important. But what you were doing right now with those young kids, or if you're a husband that's helping raise a young family, everything that you're doing is part of your story and part of what your journey is. And if you feel like you're older and you haven't kind of yet made your call or answered what it is you're supposed to do, I just think there's so many people who could step in and mentor and help and give their wisdom and experience, and that maybe is part of their story and part of their call.
Mm-hmm. Well, the word that I want to end with is a word that you use, and it's trust the whisper. And so I think about the way that God maybe whispered or spoke directly to you through Denver, but the way that as you processed it and as you say you lived with it and it still kept you up in light. and the whisper kept on going, you ultimately trusted. You trusted even though you didn't know everything to know about everything that you were going to need to know about in order for this project to come together. You didn't know everything about the subject. You didn't know who was going to show up. You didn't know who was going to be there to financially support it. You didn't know who was going to come to the table to be partners with you in all the work that is going on now, whether it be through hospitals or social workers. You didn't know any of this stuff, but you trusted. And I just want to say, thank you for trusting, Kathy.
Yes.
Thank you and Charlie, and the whole family. Thank you all, because I know it hasn't been just about you. You're very clear about that. It's been about a family's discernment. It's been about a group of friends' discernment. It's been
huge
a big
community.
Coalition of friends, many of them who are here right now.
They are.
And it's been about creating a movement. And you have done that. And you've done it many times. And so we give thanks to God for you and you for trusting the whisper. And what I'd like to do now is I'd like for us to say a prayer together as we leave, asking that God would continue to work out what generosity means for each of us. Because it means so many different things, doesn't it? And what I love about this story is that Kathy has found something that has been generative for her. I love it when you say that you got as much from it than as anything that you gave. So let's pray that prayer today. The Lord be with you. Lord, we give you thanks for the way that you speak to us. We can't always totally understand. We sometimes wonder if the things that you're putting in front of us are distractions or if they're things that we should take hold of. Help us, Lord, to stay with it, to stay with you, to listen, to allow ourselves to be restless. And help us to trust. The trust that if it is your will, we will move with you into our sacred callings. And that in finding and living that calling, not only will we be enlarged, but the world through us and through our labors will know of your healing, transforming love. This we ask in the name of Jesus, who keeps speaking to us and will forever speak to us and call us by name, Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Kathy, thank you so very much.
Thank you.